It's good to be here. It feels like it's been a while. And I was noticing that the male pastors at Ann Arbor CRC, we might need to up our creativity, because I think we all have the same blazer shirt combo. So we'll just start with a confession and put it out there, since our text today does deal with brokenness and room for improvement. But it's good to be back here. I've been doing a little bit of guest preaching, travel, a cohort intensive, and then COVID knocked us out for a little while, so it's been a bit of a January into February, and it's good to be back here. Our text today comes from Matthew 5, so we're continuing in the lectionary, and we're moving past the Beatitudes, past the "You are salt and light" that Pastor Noah preached on last week, and we're entering into some commands. And I spent a good amount of time this week and last week wrestling with these commands of how we read them, what they mean, how do we interpret them as hearers would have heard them, but then what do they actually mean in a messy and a broken world today? So I think we say that the best kind of preaching is an invitation into a conversation. So I hope that through our conversation today on Matthew 5, that we meet Jesus together, and that you leave with questions, curiosity, thoughts to discuss around the lunch table, the dinner table, the breakfast table throughout this week, that we can meet Jesus with curiosity. So we enter into Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 17 and moving all the way through verse 37. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there, before the altar, and go. First, be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him. Or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out. Throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is a footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. The word of the Lord. What do we make of these commands? What do we do with these hard words that feel absolutely impossible to live up to? I even have questions about how we interpret, how we think through some of what Jesus says today, let alone the severity and the weight. I think about these words and wrestling with them earlier this week and last week. I had to wonder, are some of these words safe? Are they even okay given the way they've been wielded? If you just do a bodily assessment of how you're feeling right now, hearing some of these passages, are you tense? Are your fists clenched? Are your toes clenched together? Are you feeling stressed? Are these words even safe? I don't think they're safe. After a week of wrestling with them, I don't think they're safe. I do think that they're good. I do know that these words have not always been good, coming from me, coming from others, coming from teachers, coming from pastors, coming from leaders. But we hold this knowing that these words are good because these words come from a person, not just a book, not just a set of commands. These words come from Jesus. And that matters. That matters a lot. That matters because we heard Pastor Mike preach 2 weeks ago on the Beatitudes that start with, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are we when we feel ruined. Blessed are we when we feel unloved, uncared for. The Sermon on the Mount starts there. And then after it ends, Jesus goes on to heal 4 or 5 different people. There are stories of healing the leper, and then the person in power healing the centurion's servant, and then Jesus healing many at Peter's house. These words are not safe, but we do believe these words are good because they're spoken by Jesus, because they're spoken by a person that isn't intending to cut us down, to break us apart, and to leave us there. And fundamentally, as we read these words, we want to meet Jesus. Meeting Jesus doesn't mean having all the answers to the hard questions. I do not. So as we read verse 17, it says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished." This almost feels like a bait and switch because Jesus is saying, I've come to fulfill the law. And I have a question on timeline of what that means. Did that happen when Jesus was at the cross, dying and said, "It is finished, it is accomplished"? Did it happen when Jesus stood up in his prophetic role in Luke 4, giving some of his first prophetic words to say, on this day, in the hearing of my words, this is accomplished. The prisoner set free, the poor cared for, Jesus arriving. Is that the day that was fulfilled? And if it is fulfilled when Jesus is speaking here, then why is Jesus saying, I've fulfilled the law? We're not under this devastating reality of brokenness, of messing up, of constantly having to live up to a reality that's impossible. How do we handle this when then Jesus raises the bar and says, "You have heard, but I'm gonna ratchet it up a little bit and say, actually, unless you're like the Pharisees who in Matthew 23, he does not have many good things to say about. Unless you are like the Pharisees, unless your righteousness exceeds that, unless you are perfect, you're not living up to this." So what do we make of this? And we have to realize that when we are met by Jesus, we're not always met with having our big questions answered. I've read commentators throughout the last couple weeks. I don't think we fully understand what it means that Jesus fulfills the law and then calls us to a higher standard. But we'll start with the words of a theologian that we've been following throughout this series, Dale Bruner, who takes a stab at what this means, that Christ fulfilled the law, but then is still saying, this is the standard that I'm holding you to. And Bruner says, "I think, however, that Matthew binds the Christian to a law that has been both fully fulfilled and fully reinterpreted by Jesus, and so binds us more to Jesus and not just to the law. Binds us more to Jesus and not just to the law." So it matters that on the front end of these very difficult commands, we are being bound to Jesus. We're being bound up in a person that lived and died, that comes alongside us as we wrestle with this reality. But as we meet Jesus, we don't have all the answers. But we still have to have some. And so we continue with this text, and we wonder what it means for us today. As we meet Jesus, Jesus shows us how to love people. And Jesus doesn't just show us how to love people. Jesus shows us how to love without exerting power over people. So this element of power and what it means to love without domination, without wanting to control, without wanting to own, without wanting to consume, that's what these commands have everything to do with. And so we're going to work through them one by one. We're not going to pull out everything because we can't do that, but we're going to see how Jesus is calling us to love well through these commands. And so in verse 22, we read Jesus saying, "But I say to you, that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." Jesus is trying to teach us how to love well, how to love our enemies well. And one reality that often happens is anger that festers. There were some early commentators that added in a manuscript saying, being angry without cause. That's what Jesus is talking about. But Jesus is actually talking about being angry here in general. Not an outburst of anger, not righteous anger, but sustained anger that grows and builds and develops and festers. Because when we hold that kind of anger, we can't love people well. That kind of anger, it actually protects us. Because when we're angry at a people, when we're angry at a culture, when we're angry at a church, we have power over that person. It's a barrier between us and them. We're protected by that anger. And Jesus, talking to a group of people who have a lot to be angry about, he's saying, break down that wall. That sustaining anger is not worth it. We can't erase that kind of anger to love our enemies, to love people we can't stand, to love the other political party easily. We can't do that in a day, but we can at least acknowledge it and say, I'm holding this anger, And, and this anger is separating me from the love that God is calling me to. And that's a step. That might be the only step that we're asking of each other today, to acknowledge that if Jesus meets us in love through this passage, then Jesus meets us to encourage us to love people we don't want to love with humility, without barriers. And I do want us to picture the scene. This is Jesus who people are just meeting for the first time. He's just starting out on his ministry. He's already healed some people. He's getting famous. People are following him. But just picture who's in the crowd. They're probably people who don't have the best day jobs, or they're people who are already so angry at Jesus they need to follow him, like following that person on social media that you just want to be angered by. So there are people in this crowd that are meeting Jesus, and Jesus says, in order to hear these words, in order to enter into a relationship with me, into the kingdom, to learn about what God is all about, it's stepping back, acknowledging that anger. Jesus meets us in love and shows us how to love without anger. And we can imagine a world where this, well, I don't know if I can imagine a world where this had happened, because in verse 23, he says, so when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Then come and offer your gift. Again, some people reading this scripture say that's not literal. It's not possible, because if somebody's worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem, but they're actually from a village in the far reaches of Galilee, they're not going to just leave their gift, go take a day's walk, and then come back later. That's not feasible. But I think we're called to hear these words directly with their full impact. And just think about if the people who are writing the Dutch confessions in the 16th century, the 17th century, had realized that they were simultaneously, or at the least their government was simultaneously enslaving people in the Caribbean. And they had said, we can't even worship while this is happening. We can't be part of this in any way, shape, or form. And work to create change. It would have been a different world. But now 200, 300, 400 years later, it's no wonder we feel anger. We feel guilt that comes out in anger when we receive histories of what's happened in our name, in our church's name, in our country's name. It's no wonder. And so this is Jesus teaching a crowd, not just individuals, what it means to love well, what it means to drop everything, walk to the far reaches of Galilee and say, I can't be here fully until I'm okay with my neighbor. And we often hear we need to focus primarily on Christ. We shouldn't focus on those other things. And the beauty is that when we focus on Christ, Christ says focus on your sister or your brother. So as we focus on Christ at the altar, Jesus says, hey, remember your sister or your brother, because that's who I care about. So then we move on to what does it mean that Jesus meets us and shows us how to love others well through the commands of adultery. In verse 29, Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out. Tear it out. When we look at these commands through the lens of power, of Jesus encouraging us to recognize who do we have power over, who are we trying to control, these passages make a lot of sense. Lust is deeply rooted in a desire for power. It's a desire to have a relationship on our own terms, to control somebody in a way that we want them to be controlled. And fundamentally, Lust is failing to see the other person in all their leadership, in all their power, in all their wisdom, in everything that makes them human and in the image of God. Lust fails to say that, so it makes sense that Jesus says, you're already not seeing that person in front of you for who they are. So you might as well just tear your eye out and complete the picture, because you're not seeing them anyway. This is a call to humility. This is a call not then just for people who are not married, the Apostle Paul's words of burning with lust, but there's this book written by 3 evangelical women called The Great Sex Rescue. And they narrate horrific stories after horrific stories that happen every day of, in this case, husbands demanding their wives to do things because it's their right, it's their prerogative throughout marriages that are all around us. And Jesus is looking out for the person who does not have power in this relationship and is saying that lust means seeing other people as people, as humans, as image bearers, approaching people with this deep love and shedding our power. And then divorce. Through this lens of what it means to love well, it makes sense that Jesus talks about divorce. There were these 2 traditions within the Roman Jewish faith. And one said that men, in this case, could divorce their wife for almost any reason at all. So Josephus, who was writing in AD 30, he was a Roman Jewish historian, doesn't represent the full tradition of the Jewish faith, but a part of it. He wrote about how he divorced his wife because he was leaving the city. He was moving away from Alexandria. And through one strain of interpretation of Deuteronomy, that was allowed. You could do that. You could divorce a wife for any reason. And so what Jesus is saying is what love means when it comes to divorce. Love means protecting people. Love means ensuring that women in that context, and let's be honest, women certainly today are leaders, are people deserving of deep, deep care and attention. And so Jesus is saying this is not okay. You can't just do that. He's heightening the rules on divorce because that would have left a woman destitute and alone, without money and without power. There are a lot of questions we have about this, about what this command of divorce means for us today. Unfortunately, we've weaponized this to produce more shame and to produce more guilt, instead of recognizing that Christ here isn't fundamentally protecting the institution, the sanctity, the purity of marriage for its own sake. Jesus is protecting the sanctity and the personhood of people. And marriage is certainly a means to that. That's important. But Jesus isn't primarily interested in marriage as the thing that does this. We know that marriage passes away in the life to come. Jesus is primarily interested in people, and in people who don't have power. And that's a different lens to view these commands through. It doesn't lessen them. It leaves us with questions. But we sit with it, and we recognize the weight of what Jesus is calling us to. And then concerning oaths, I think oaths, vows, this is probably the most overlooked command in the Beatitudes. I think we skim right by it. What do vows and oaths have to do with power and loving ourselves and loving our neighbors as Jesus meets us? We read, "But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of a great king. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one." Certainly, there's a piece of this that Jesus is calling us to be simply, humbly honest, of saying yes and saying no, not overly exaggerating what we're trying to say, being people of simple integrity. But beneath this is also the reality of where oaths are made. Oaths and vows, those were often made between citizens and the state. In this case, it was often the case of the upper crust of the religious elite, of the scribes, that would make vows with Caesar, and they would kind of tiptoe around these laws. Jesus is heightening these laws, but he's saying you found the loopholes here, because instead of vowing, instead of making a law in God's name, Yahweh wouldn't even have been a spoken name. Some of the upper crust are making promises and vows in the name of Jerusalem or their own hair in order to avoid the big name of God, but still make their alliances with the state. And Jesus is saying this is not okay, because those were alliances that were made that then benefited the people at the top, that cozied people up to the government, to Caesar, at the expense of people who were at the bottom. So there's an abuse of power here that's tied in with vows and oaths. And fundamentally what it's doing is it's allowing people to trust in the state, in the government, instead of trusting in the name of God. Instead of placing all of our hope, all of our fundamental assurance on God. So I think this might be one of the hardest commands for us, because where do we make oaths? Where do we see vows? We see them if we're taking somebody to court, in the protections that come from taking somebody to court. We see them in military service. We see them in the Pledge of Allegiance that I certainly grew up with, going to Christian school. We see them in these things that place our trust in powers that aren't actually powers. And Jesus is saying, do none of that. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. I don't know if you've been following the news, but I think just yesterday there was a third unidentified object shot down over the Yukon in Canada. And I think the headlines were having some fun with this because it was shot down by a U.S. jet, military aircraft. But it was shot down with the subtext by Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada's orders. And I don't know if you felt this in your heart, but I felt it in mine. I felt like this sense of deep pride for the American military, which kind of sneaked up on me in unexpected ways. And I just want to note that. I don't necessarily want to make a value judgment of that, but I just want to note that we certainly have a lot of trust and faith and a sigh of relief that's kind of secret deep down there whenever we see events that are happening a world away, because we know fundamentally we have this protection from the American military. And Jesus is saying, take a look at that. Have you sworn an oath to something that can't ultimately protect you? And who might it not be protecting? That's a hard command to think about. So as you reread these verses over lunch throughout this week, we can feel pretty broken. We can feel pretty broken. And historically, I think we've responded to that brokenness by pointing fingers at the thing that is a little less broken in our lives, often the things that are a little more visible here, pointing over there and kind of building that wall and feeling a little safe by doing that. But when Jesus meets us and encourages us to love without power, without control, without pretense, Jesus is welcoming us into brokenness. Into brokenness. That's certainly where we're left with at the end of these Beatitudes. And I think we can say that this brokenness can be a unifying reality. I know that there are people here today for whom brokenness is simply a daily reality. Whether it's the result of some of these commands, whether it's how we realized we've lived into these in unhealthy ways, whether it's just persistent anxiety, depression, fear, mental health that's plaguing us, we know brokenness. And so we picture the scene of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is not just preaching this to one person, preaching it to an entire group. And just as Pastor Noah said, Jesus declares, you are salt and light. You all are already bought with a price. Just as our perfection is collective, so our brokenness is together. We're broken together. And I want us to be that kind of a church that can be broken. I was thinking back 3 years ago, I have a good friend, and I realized that I said something to her that was certainly inflected with racism. And I was shocked that I had said this. This was a good Korean friend of mine. I should not have said it. There was no excuse for it. It didn't make sense. I realized it that night. The next day, I came up and apologized to her. I was forgiven. But I realized in that evening, almost a sigh of relief, because I had done something dumb, part of a bigger system. But I had done something dumb, and acknowledging that felt like a strange sense of relief, of this clarity, of recognizing I did this. I have to own it. I have to live into it. I'm capable of this. That's not okay. And there was a grounding reality that pointed me, actually connected me closer to this friend, and certainly to God, and certainly to the reality of my own humility and brokenness. Because these things surprise us. They sneak up on us. If we can be that together, then that is a step toward living into this Sermon on the Mount. Recognizing brokenness, acknowledging it when we see it. Ross Gay is one of my favorite poets. And he has this new book called Inciting Joy. And in this book, he writes a lot about sorrow. And I think what he writes about sorrow could be replaced with the word brokenness. And so I'm going to go out on a limb and apologize to Ross Gay and read this paragraph, which is this imaginative, beautiful description of a bunch of people who are broken or lamenting or sorrowful, showing up to a party together and being that broken people together, because this is my vision for what Ann Arbor CRC can be. This is why I love working in cohort in Detroit and Hesed Community Church, because it's people who have no illusion of our brokenness. We just are. So this is what Ross Gay says, hosting a dinner party of brokenness. He says, I'd like you to meet my brokenness. We holler at each other, dipping the flatbread into the hummus, or eating the kimchi with our fingers because the forks are long gone. Good to meet you, we shout, smiling and nodding at the brokenness, who also smiles and nods, and half shrugs and raises their eyebrows. This is mine, we yell, pulling the spoon from the dal we're eating to point to our brokenness. Who takes a bite of the lentils and laughs. Well done, brokenness. Everyone jostles that brokenness, and he leans up against who he came with. And around those oatmeal raisin chocolate chip cookies gathers a gaggle of guests, and their brokenness giggling and pretending to fight over the last cookie before one of the brokennesses breaks it into 10 pieces, and they all take their bite from brokenness's hand, moaning like a choir. When we meet Jesus, we're driven to love others like Jesus, without power, without pretense. When we meet Jesus, we meet brokenness. And when we meet Jesus together, here, present, around this table where brokenness literally abounds, that is a start to who we are and who we can be because Jesus meets us here. Amen.